Everybody. My name is Jens Ponikau. I'm a certified geothermal designer as well as an installer. And I'm also the vice president for the New York Geothermal Energy Organization. So this is a presentation we gave to the Public Service Commission and filed it onto the records, so they have access to it as well. And we thought it would be beneficial to start looking at those numbers we have gathered and make them public to everybody and accessible to everybody. So there is essentially the basis for this are two publications. One of them is a report by the Brattle Group for Rhode Island about giving the state of Rhode Island a pathway to decarbonization. It was commissioned by the state agency for them, and they were just looking at, obviously their gas network and the fossil fuels they're using, and they were simply asking the question, what happens if we convert this, and how are we going to convert this? Because we're obviously talking about an enormous amount of thermal energy which we need to replace with electricity. So this is from their report. And by the way, just as a full disclosure, the Brattle Group had run some of their calculations by me just to verify them, and they were spot on. And just so you know that I was involved in verifying some of their numbers in that regard. The second one is actually the Gold Book, which is published by the New York State Independent Operators, and I'll summarize that in a second. So this is actually from the Brattle Group here, and you can see that that Rhode Island is pretty much in the same boat as New York State. They don't differ very much. Space and water heating makes up about 96% of the entire energy use delivered currently by fossil fuels. The rest is cooking and gas washer dryers or other thermal needs they have there. But the vast majority, about 78%, is for space conditioning, about 18% is for domestic hot water. And again, these are three different reports which were published. We'll talk about the New York State Independent System Operator Climate Change Impact Study. Actually, the first phase, what their estimation of the long-term impact is. Number two, it is the current capacity data, which was published with some delay because of COVID. They usually do that in the spring of every year, where they analyze the data from last year and look at their capacity and load data and what the implications is for long-term planning. And then the one I just mentioned is the heating sector transformation in Rhode Island and its pathway to the decarbonization. So when we're talking about heat pumps, and obviously we don't have many other choices than to go the heat pump route, except us doing this with fully electric resistance heat, it is important to understand on how they operate and how the heating load is there and might be different. So for example, the red line here is when you start heating a building at about 65 degrees, you start increasing load there. So the vast majority of the time, we're spending our time between 27 and 62 degrees. And this is when the amount of kilowatt hours we need to satisfy that load is going to be crucial. The problem is that we're going to have a few hours a year, not too many, which will not look at the overall seasonal energy we use, but it's actually the so-called demand, which determines the amount we need to size the system for to cover the colder days of the year. So for example, we are seeing hours here, which sometimes, this is our design criterion. For example, in Buffalo, we're talking about the 6 degrees, but we have days where it's -12. So we have to go beyond our design criterion. Now looking at the demand, And why demand is important. Every single country is actually looking at a shift in demand, who has actually transformed the heating process from fossil fuels into electrifying it. The best examples are Scandinavia, but all other countries which are starting to go into that endeavor is seeing their peak heating, their peak demand for electricity shift from the evening hours, and going into the morning hours, usually between 6 and 8 a.m. The main reason for that is that the domestic hot water is shifted and now becomes electrified, but also that people use sometimes a setback during the night and then start to rev up the heating systems again, and the same is occurring for the office space. So the point of the presentation is that replacing the propane and oil heating systems in New York State with either an air source heat pump or a ground source heat pump will have dramatically different results. And I walk you through why that is. So we currently have an infrastructure built to cover our summer peak, which is about 31 gigawatts currently, 32. The highest peak was close to 34, which was about 7 years ago. And then there's a winter peak, which goes up to about 25 gigawatts. So this is the current peak we see in the system. And our base load, that means our average load every day, is about 17 gigawatts. So you can see we built a large amount of infrastructure only to use it for a couple minutes a year. And those are the peak minutes. I'd argue it's actually a second. And the law requires us here in New York State to have enough capacity for our peak plus 19%. The 19% comes from the assumption that maybe one of the major nuclear plants might be going down or shutting down during those peak events, and we have to have resilience and reserves in the system to not having blackouts during unexpected shutdowns. Now, this is from the Rhode Island report, and what they emphasize on, that there's a dramatic difference between performance in comparison to the outside temperature between ground source and air source heat pumps. The ground source heat pumps operate relatively stable at the same kind of efficiency. And they dialed in or used an efficiency here of 3.6, that means 360% efficiency. However, air source heat pumps, and those are now the mini splits they took as an example, are decreasing that capacity significantly because they use the outside air as a source. The ground source heat pumps use the ground, which is stable. And in all the studies we have seen and done, and outside companies have done on behalf of some stakeholders in the state, et cetera, they have confirmed that the ground source heat pumps do not lose their efficiency or capacity. However, air source heat pumps do both. That means they operate less efficient because there's simply lesser heat in the outside at lower temperatures. And they go towards a COP of 1 when it gets down to around 0 degrees outdoor temperature. So just to point this out further, the efficiency and the capacity is dependent on the source temperature. That means the temperature of the ground in terms of ground source. And this is one of the reasons that the capacity of the heat pumps for ground source are not going down on colder days, and they don't need backup in order to be operational. And the air source heat pumps, they lose their efficiency, but they also lose their capacity as colder temperatures. And this is the reason why they do need fossil fuel or electric backup, at least in most applications we're putting them in currently. So that's going to be having dramatic different results for the grid and the grid planning. because this is again a slide from the Rhode Island report from the Braddock Group. They looked at 3 scenarios, or actually 4 scenarios. They look at how it is in Rhode Island, but in 2018, and this is the dotted line here. And that tells you, okay, we're gonna have a certain amount of bin hours, but then on the coldest hours of the year, the rarest ones, which are reflected here, only a few hours a year, it starts to go up almost vertically. That means we're starting to use electricity for backup heating currently in our system. Not too much, but we're going to see a spike, or we saw a spike up to about 26 gigawatt hours. And that is pretty much the same way we see it in New York State. So the data is almost identical. Now they run different forecast scenarios. They said, okay, forget all of that. Let's not go with electric heat at all. Let's continue our current scenarios and see where we're going to be in 2040, 2050. And because, you know, there's an increase in population, increase in demand to a certain degree, more buildings being built, they project that this goes up to 37 gigawatts in that scenario. Now, if we are all electrifying this with ground source heat pumps, yes, our overall demand for electricity goes up over the year, which is good. We're going to use more electricity. But then we also see a peak there going up in the coldest days of the year, which is approximately 44 gigawatts. However, if we're doing this all with air source heat pumps, the overall energy efficiency is very similar, because on warmer days they perform just about as good as the ground source heat pumps, because the outside might be at the same temperature where the ground is. However, now on the colder days, and specifically the peak day, they're gonna go up more than exponentially. They're just going up almost vertically to 73 gigawatts. So what that all means is, if we're implementing ground source heat pumps instead of air source heat pumps, we are preserving about 30 gigawatts of electricity. Just as a comparison, that is about as much capacity as we have in the entire New York State as a peak. That is a tremendous amount of energy we're only going to use for a few hours a year, but we need to have a readiness for it if we choose to go this route. Oops. So the impact for that is relatively tremendous. If we go this route with ground source heat pumps, the actual energy for the year is not that difference between the two technologies. Yes, air source heat pumps is a little bit less efficient. It will need 15% higher capacity than we currently have in the system. And ground source heat pumps will only need an upgrade of 12%. However, the peak is going to be looking dramatically different. The peak is going to go up by 17% with ground source. However, with air source, it would be going up 94%, almost doubling our readiness and our need for that. The important point from a grid perspective is that our load factor, that means how much percent of the grid are we currently utilizing, would be around 61% with ground source. However, it would drop down to 38% because we would have all this readiness sitting there at idle and not operating. It would be essentially the most inefficient grid you could imagine. So that not only has an effect on capacity planning and how much capacity we would have, as well as expenditures we would have, but it actually, because this increase in capacity would have to be rate-based, we would have to come up with different ways of looking at this. Again, this is a modeling for Rhode Island. they have relatively high costs here, and they split this up between transmission costs, generation costs, and then essentially, other generation in the wholesale market coming in, like behind the meter, et cetera, windmills, et cetera. So the current cost is about 18 cents per kilowatt hour for supply and delivery in the Rhode Island market. Then if you would come in and say, well, we wouldn't do electric heat because our demand would go up and our costs would go up over the years, they project this to be about 24 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, if we would have a mixed heat portfolio, that means some fossil fuels, some ground source, some air source, that would actually benefit because, we could turn off the air source or the electrified heating portfolio and supplement it with the gas or other means. So the price would be almost the same. Then if we would install ground source heat pumps, the price would be also very similar because it would spread out the usage of kilowatt hours, the increase in kilowatt hours over the whole year. We would utilize that in that fashion, and we wouldn't need the increase in capacity. So our CapEx costs would significantly be reduced. However, if we're doing this with air source heat pumps, they're showing about a 5 cent per kilowatt increase in price on average, depending on different scenarios. That means the grid would be significantly less efficient. I showed you the slide before. Let me just go back to this one here. Whoops. This is really the difference in the load factor. Are we going to have a grid which is relatively well balanced, or are we going to have a grid which is, not utilized a lot and has to sit at idle because we only need the peak capacity? The importance here is, for example, I believe the load factor in New York State went up from 52% to 58% in the last years. And they celebrated this actually because every percentage point cost the New York State ratepayer about $200 million per year, because it is so much more expensive to have all this capacity sitting at idle, and it needs to be maintained and paid off. So having a higher load factor is really, really beneficial. But that's what we would lose here with the air source heat pump scenario because of their lack of efficiency at very cold temperatures, but we still would need heat during that time. This is reflected now, and we're switching gear now a little bit to the New York State scenario. And it has been, certainly, it's the very first time that there are now data published with the CLCPA, the climate bill, right here, incorporated in the analysis. Because now all the state agencies have to consider the impact and the compliance with the climate bill since it became New York State law. So it's interesting. So we have the Gold Book, we have the reference scenario, we have all the other policies we have in there, and they predict an increase in electricity for winter peak. But now, for the very first time, they looked at the impact of electrifying the heating sector, and they used air source heat pumps and electric resistance heat as a scenario. Electric resistance heat meaning for the domestic hot water. And you can see what dramatic impact that has in the middle of the winter on their winter peak. Well, keep in mind, we don't have the solar arrays helping us with behind meter, what they do in the summer peak during the hottest days of the year. They obviously produce one of the most energy during that time. And so this has a tremendous impact onto the peak forecast. Now, this is not the official number coming from the ISO, from New York ISO, from the independent system operators. This is just a study they had commissioned to assist them with their forecast. These are actually their official numbers. And the problem is, so this is the so-called the Gold Book, which is the Bible for the capacity planning. And this is the 2020 load and capacity data. The problem was that they did not have those graphs in there. They only had the data in tables in the gold book, pretty much at the end of it. And there was a dramatic difference what that 1 year makes between the implementation need for the climate bill and for the year before. So I looked at their forecast a year before, which is the blue line. They show an increase in their winter peak going from 25 gigawatts to about 32 gigawatts. And you could say, yeah, no, over a time frame of 25 years, we can see the increase in demand and an increase in electricity. But oh boy, when they now have to comply with the climate bill, that changes dramatically. And that is from 1 year to the other. Their forecast planning shows a very different result. They didn't go beyond 2045 in the 2019 period, but now they're forecasting up to 2050 because that's when the climate bill has to be all implemented. And you can see the dramatic shift here. It essentially more than doubles our winter peak in the entire system. The bad news, if I run the numbers and I'm looking at all this, I'm thinking it's about underestimated by a factor of 2. So I think personally that this entire line is much steeper because they haven't fully accounted for the lack of efficiency. They just took manufacturing data and plugged it into their evaluations when it comes to air source heat pumps. We come up with a scenario where currently air source heat pumps are adding about 100 gigawatts to the peak load, and now you're adding the domestic hot water and you're adding the electric cars to it. You will find a dramatically different, even much worse scenario than their own numbers indicate. So again, these are their numbers. So they have different scenarios there, and they carved out the increase caused by electric vehicles and the increase caused by the heating and the cooking and the domestic hot water. And you can see here the impact of the building envelope on peak, not the building envelope, the technology we use for that is dramatic. Everybody talks about it and says, well, how are we going to have all the energy for the electric vehicles? But that number is dwarfing the impact of the heating sector if this is done by air source heat pumps as well as domestic hot water electric resistance heat. Again, these are their numbers. We didn't change the numbers. We just put them onto some graphs to visualize that much better. Forget the need for electric vehicles. It's really the heating and cooling, which is essential in avoiding a dramatic grid impact here. Now, we're looking now at the peak demand forecast between summer and winter in New York State. We can see currently our peak demand, as I said, is around 33 or 32 gigawatts. But now because of our climate getting warmer and more people having air conditioning, they expect an increase to approximately 55, 56 gigawatts in the next 25 years for the summertime. But again, forget the summertime. By 2035, approximately, they expect us to switch over to winter peak, and quite dramatically, because the 2035 is one of the milestones, and then 2040 as well, where certain portions of the CLCPA have to be implemented. So they expect a rush to the finish line here, and then rush again in 2040. But look at the striking difference between summer and winter. Again, I point out that this is already with air source heat pumps and the impact of them, not with ground source. And the importance is to realize that there's going to be a dramatic shift, and we will not have the support by any kind of behind the meter solar roofs like we have in the summertime. So this is actually looking at the change in percentage points. And I found that interesting. We run the numbers, again, it's their numbers, and said, well, how much of a change is that actually percentage-wise? We start to realize that for the summertime, we're only going to have a change in percentage, which is about 30% difference when we stretch this out to 2050. However, in the winter time, we're going to see a percentage with about 155% difference when it comes to the peak demand need. So it makes very clear that we don't have to worry so much over the summertime. We can actually expect this to go down because we're going to have much more a push for solar, and then slowly a push up with the increasing demand. But look what's going to happen in the wintertime. We go up pretty straightforward by 23, 24, and we're going to see an increase in winter peak, which is going to be significant. So these are, I mentioned before that I personally think that this is grossly underestimated, the impact of it. Why do I think that way? Well, if we're just looking at the entire heating load, which is now published by, I think it was the Meister Group who did the analysis for NYSERDA, and we're looking at different buildings. These are the single family homes. We have about close to 3 million in New York State. And then they're looking at the multifamilies, the large multifamilies, and adding the commercial sector to it. And you can see here, if you can look at the million BTUs they use per year, and these are actually current actual data, we see that the buildings in New York have a winter peak currently, or have a winter peak of about close to 100 gigawatts. And that's why we think the numbers they have are grossly underestimated. Now, they're counting a lot of increasing efficiency in buildings, but we question whether they can and retrofit those buildings at reasonable costs to perform that much better, to say, no, this is not 97 gigawatts. We think this is only about 45. Currently, it's 97. So that's one of the questions why I'm questioning whether we're going to have the right matrix sometimes when we are looking at the amount of energy only and how much we're consuming. Because, the green bars show you, that we have, a certain amount of energy we use, and we're looking at how much energy we're avoiding and how many carbons we're saving. So air source heat pumps look pretty good. They actually take away the electric resistance heat, and then geothermal look actually much better. However, this is why we have a good amount of incentives for our total amount of energy savings. And then we have higher incentives for geothermal because they save more. The problem is the black bar now shows you what is the projected amount of peak they avoid. And nobody really looks at that because we're focusing completely on the total amount of energy saved and the total amount of carbons avoided. But we have to start looking at how much is this all going to cost us, and how efficient is the grid then, and how much are we going to having to add to the rate down the road to make this all feasible. And you can see here the difference between electric resistance heat and air source heat pumps. We need to exactly put the same capacity in because we're going to need it. But it will be an extremely inefficient way of dealing with it because we're building a capacity which we only use a few hours a year. The nice thing about geothermal heat pumps is that they don't need that capacity spike. They're still going to increase the amount of kilowatt hours used, and therefore they're actually going to lower the price per kilowatt hour. But also, what they will affect is they have a better effect of cutting out the gas distribution network and avoiding it completely because they don't need any kind of fossil fuel backup. So it becomes very clear what the heating system for the future has to be. It must operate in a way that their efficiency and capacity is not dependent on the outside temperature. Because when we need it most, we cannot afford to lose capacity and efficiency on the coldest days of the year. It also must cover the full load without going into supplemented resistance heat. Imagine when all the heat pumps in the state are going into supplement resistance heat at the COP of 1 at the same hour. It would completely collapse the grid. It might not only reduce the heating, but also the cooling load, because the summer cooling load is going to be significant as well. And keep in mind, we're going to shift a lot of the electric hot water load into the electric grid. So we're going to add actually to the summer peak, unless we have smart ways to store the energy, use it at the off-peak time, or avoid it entirely and make it with a much, much higher efficiency. And that's the fourth point, that we cannot afford to make the domestic hot water without electric resistance heat, because specifically the hot water usage coincides with the peak in electrical demand for winter heating. And so we have to do whatever we can to either shift that to a different time period, or to avoid the inefficient way to making hot water to begin with. So hot water will be a tremendously important part of the puzzle here, and about the plan to go forward. I explained before that, you know, we are starting to have, under those guidances, design systems which fulfill all those criteria. That we have now the geosystems being all on one borehole. You can see here the pipes coming in. There's one pumping station, and it serves a forced air heat pump doing heating and air conditioning, but it also serves an independent water heat pump, which can make all your hot water, store it in a tank, and we can control that with a certain timer. It makes it first with obviously approximately 350% efficiency, but also it can be timed and stored. And that's one of the important aspects here. So, you know, a couple of things which we should probably think about. Should we push to have air source heat pumps installed only in the moment where ground source heat pumps are not feasible? Is it a good public policy right now to say, yeah, let's go ahead. It's going to cost us the same, or there may be a couple $1,000s more to put it into a new build. But you know what? It's cheaper for the person to install. And yeah, it creates a nightmare for the grid, but you know, that's not the problem of the person. So should we have a more direct policy where we reserve air source heat pumps only for the areas like dense urban settings where ground source heat pumps are not feasible? Is the 33% renewable gas air source heat pump, ground source heat pump scenario they propose, or no, they give us an option for Rhode Island to say, well, if we balance that in a certain way, we won't have much grid impact. We actually have a backup that way. We can use renewable gas as a backup for air source heat pumps. Is this a financially attractive scenario? Or is the combined price for those scenarios more expensive than paying for the increase in price for ground source heat pumps? Is our current notion for technology neutrality feasible? You know, regulators always like to sit there and say, well, we're going to tell you the rules, and how you get there is up to you. We have an obligation not to favor one technology over another. But if one technology has such a negative impact on the future grid versus another one, is this really the right approach still? Or do we need to say, well, we need to look at peak impact, because we cannot leave that choice to the consumer, because we have to build all the readiness and all the peak capacity into the system, and tremendous costs and tremendous system inefficiency. And if the consumer doesn't care because he wants to have the cheapest solution, can we allow to do that? And, you know, even if we have similar technologies, for example, heat pump technologies, there will be a tremendously different cost impact for the grid because the difference in peak demand. And I always essentially emphasize that the difference between air source heat pump and ground source heat pump is really not that much. It's really the difference in cost when it comes to the ground loop. And imagine we would look at the ground loop not as a source for thermal energy, but more as a thermal battery, a way to store the energy, because the ground source heat pumps do not discharge the energy in the summertime into the atmosphere and then trying to recapture it in the wintertime. So they discharge it at the worst case scenario, and they try to retrieve it at the worst case scenario when the atmosphere has cooled down so much. Well, ground source is a little bit different. It stores it actually underground, and a portion of that we recover during the season. Now imagine you would have solar, and you have solar and a large enough storage, which can essentially deliver the storage for the solar energy you need, or for the electricity the solar is producing, for 6 months to get you over the winter. If you would have a battery which can store the solar energy you need for your house for 6 months, and all that on a 6-inch footprint, which is the diameter of the borehole, we wouldn't need a grid anymore. We wouldn't have a grid anymore. And that's the value which the ground loop is bringing to the table. And this is something people need to philosophically understand. It's really a storage capacity, and there's an enormous amount of storage the ground loop brings to the table. It stores easily over 100 million BTUs down there, and it's accessible on demand. How much is that worth? Because if we don't look at how much that is worth to the grid, the costs of mitigating the deficiencies of not having that storage built in is tremendously higher in the system per household. And that stresses out the need for financing, maybe. And maybe it's a smarter way to put the money into a distributed storage solution, which the ground loop is, than having the capacity built in to generate all that electricity on demand on the worst time of the year. And that's the kind of discussion I think we should have and we need when we're talking about technology neutrality, or whether we should have an idea where public policy needs to enter into and saying we can't allow that to happen. We can't actually afford this to happen, to build the most or the least efficient technology scenario here for the grid. Anyway, that ends my slide.